Just because someone has, some difficulty with life doesn't necessarily mean that it's affecting them to a super great degree. So the next principle here is that eventually disease turns into disability. And when this is happening, then the daily activities are really affected. And again, this is different from person to person. There are many older individuals who are living independently until the day that they pass away, right? And there are some though that don't make it that far, where they're actually unable to really take care of themselves and live independently. And that's why we have a lot of different nursing facilities or individuals who are living with family to help them take care of them and make sure that their daily activities can be undertaken. So there are some individuals who, when this disease turns into disability, to develop instrumental problems, and essentially this is affecting their ability to live independently. So it could be affecting their ability to cook for themselves, even basic things. Affecting their ability to clean, affecting their ability to drive to the store, and when this all happens, this is affecting their autonomy. And we talked about autonomy a little bit when we talked about childhood, but we definitely talked about autonomy when we talked about adolescence. And here it is again. We talked about how it was a lifespan issue. We see that about half of the people who are 85 years old or older who are living in nursing homes or other centers like that are having instrumental problems. And that's one of the reasons why they were put in that living environment in the first place. Because if they can't cook for themselves and can't clean for themselves, this becomes exceedingly problematic. And they just can't live by themselves. I think about my own grandma in this situation who part of it was motivation, didn't want to cook for herself, but wasn't able to drive and really couldn't take care of herself. And so now she has people who help her through that. And in her um, facility that she lives in. Now, there are some people who have more significant problems, and this is affecting their daily lives to a greater degree. And these people have basic limitations, and so this is just basic self-care. So they might have the inability to even stand up, and if they can't stand, then that might limit their ability to do anything really. Although, yes, there are lots of people who live lives in wheelchairs who can still take care of themselves and meet these basic limitations. But in this situation, we're talking about people who, can't even make it to the bathroom or anything like that. This is affecting people to a good degree. 1 in 6 of the oldest old people are affected in their basic limitations or their ability to carry out these kinds of activities. Even with occupational therapy or other types of therapy, sometimes this is the situation where these tasks still can't be undertaken. And so they need other people to help them make sure that they can, live the best years of their life. And then the third principle that I wanted to talk about is essentially that eventually disability will turn into universal death. As much as we don't like to talk about these ideas and as much as we, don't want to think about these ideas, the lifespan has a limit. Yes, more people than ever are living to 100, but eventually aging happens and aging will result in death. So those are just the three principles that I wanted to talk about. And it doesn't have to be in a negative light or to think about it from a negative perspective. If we view it less as a taboo or something we don't want to talk about or something we want to avoid, and just part of the normal aging process. On the same page as talking about normal aging, we're going to be talking about some of the changes that happen to senses and cognitive development in elderhood. And again, normal parts of aging. Eventually, we will talk about disease in today's lecture, but let's start first talking about things or continuing to talk about things that we talked about in middle age. So, first of all, some sensory issues. In general, we see further declines in eyesight and hearing. Don't need to know more details than that, but we do know that there are significant declines. Many of you probably know elderly individuals who wear hearing aids, and or have thick glasses, and it's because of these normal changes that are happening in development. One of the things that isn't necessarily just related to sensory changes, but sensory changes could affect how people act, is I just wanted to make sure that you're familiar with this term, and this term is elder speak. And I actually remind people of this quite a bit. This is the idea that because the elderly look physically impaired or they look like they're struggling, then we also assume, again, not necessarily you or me, but people in general assume that they're also cognitively impaired or psychologically impaired. And so they're likely to use speech that's more like infant directed speech, essentially talking to the elderly like they're children. And this is something that we should not do. Again, most people who are probably doing it aren't aware that they're doing it or doing it to the degree that they're doing it. But this is something that we want to avoid. It's the idea that even though we're first of all, we're making these assumptions that this elderly person is struggling more than they are, but it's also problematic because essentially you're talking down to them. If you're using infant directed speech with a person who is older and being like, "Are you doing okay?" This can come off as very insulting. Um, I recently was watching a documentary about how at and this was actually mentioned in the documentary, the TED Talk that I was sharing with you guys for caregivers too. But we're never, parenting our parents. They're still always our parents. They're still always our elders. And so it's speaking to those lines too, that we're not supposed to be treating them like children because they are adults. Again, that's not specific to sensory changes. I just wanted to make sure that this key word was well known to you. In terms of taste and smell, one are senses that are tied to one another. But we know that, starting at age 60, individuals start to have reduced sensitivity to many different tastes, which is also related to smells, but to sweet, salty, sour, bitter, just kind of across the board. And there are many different reasons why that could happen over time. So some things that they have found are that is associated with those who smoke cigarettes. It could be associated with wearing dentures, which many elderly individuals do. Obviously related to certain medications and certain pollutants that they've been too exposed to in their environment. So yes, it is normal aging, but it is also affected by environmental factors. And so just in general, you see here with these sensory changes that these are a normal aging experiences, but still the environment will always matter. While we won't talk about all of the different cognitive changes that take place in elderhood and part of the aging process, we already talked about processing speed and attention and memory in middle life. But here we're going to talk more about memory specifically, and eventually we'll talk about how memory continues to decline with certain diseases. But as a whole, memory declines with age. Again, normal part of the aging process. Some of the interesting findings include that the more difficult the task, the more we're likely to see a difference between younger adults and the elderly. So that's a common finding. Again, just part of the normal aging process. Some of the reasons why this happens are reasons that we've already talked about in middle age, but just the deterioration of the frontal lobes. Remember that the frontal lobes are associated, let's say more specifically, with working memory or thinking through a problem and trying to actively recall information, so this active thinking. It also is due to some cortical shrinkage in the brain, so just we have less area to make sure that all of these memories are stored and processed. I will say, though, that memory type matters, and there's been considerable research on this. So, episodic memory is most fragile, and if you remember what episodic memory is, this is just our memories of what you ate for lunch today, or who you saw, or who your third grade teacher was. It seems to be that even though these are meaningful parts of our life, these are things that are easily lost. Are there individual differences? Yes, of course there are. But it often can be harder for elderly individuals to remember things that just happened to them yesterday, for example. For semantic memories, this can be just as good in the elderly as it is for a young adult. So semantic memories are knowledge about like things like facts. So what is the capital of Illinois? As one example. What are the biggest land mammals? So this is something that does stay around pretty well for the average elderly individual. Again, not talking about issues of disease like Alzheimer's, we're going to talk about in just a few slides, but the semantic knowledge is something that is less fragile. But the type of memory that seems to be longest lasting is procedural knowledge. So this is the idea that you never forget how to ride a bike, although I guess we can argue about that. But or playing the piano. You can see a lot of elderly individuals, even those individuals who are struggling with dementia, who are still able to show that they have this knowledge that they learned when, let's say, they were 5 years old, 6 years old. And the reason why procedural is the longest lasting is because it's affected by different areas of the brain. Essentially, it's not only your frontal lobe that's at play there. There's so many different areas of the brain that are related. For playing the piano, for example, of making those connections that are the musical connections and movement. So there are different areas of the brain that are responsible for that. So again, the take-home message is that memory type matters on which ones are more easily lost or we are having deficits in as we get older. And there are individual differences in any of these, but when we look at memory as a whole over this lifespan, we know that it is declining with age.